What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. For all of the discourse around Star-Lord, the current Season Pass card, it is my opinion and the opinion of many in High Infinite that the better of the Season Pass cards to come out in the last 2 months is still Shou-Lao. But it's not just Shou-Lao that's making the rounds at the top of the tier list today. It's Shou-Lao in the Batroc shell. And I think Batroc specifically is a card that's really worth pointing out as a genuine imbalanced card compared to approximately every other one cost in the game. Every other one cost in the game is relatively limited in its output and not really going to get to like an 8 or 10 level of points. A Batroc on 1 isn't just the points that is on the Batroc, it's the points on your Kraven, it's the points on your Hydra Stomper. You're moving this card pretty consistently, and it is providing more than just being its own little 110 or 18 or whatever it gets to. It's also giving you about, 6 or 7 points elsewhere over the course of the game with Kraven and Stomper. It's very clearly the strongest one-cost card in the game, in my humble opinion, and it is a reason why the Shou-Lao deck at the top is also a Batroc deck. This list is the Batroc version of Shou-Lao built to beat the Batroc version of Shou-Lao. A lot of what's happened in the high levels of the game recently is with Star-Lord being countered enough and still being the kind of deck that is relatively inconsistent. A lot of people are back on mid-range styles of gameplay, and this deck is just sort of the apex of that. If you're playing this deck, you are in the game against basically anything playing fair, and you even have a bit of a puncher's chance against the Star-Lord decks if they're all-inning a Zola on the Star-Lord lane. You are still functionally able to be a Cosmo deck. There is a ton of points in this deck, the ability to multiply those points with synergies, and even a little bit of interaction. There is just absolutely nothing that I can say that is negative about this deck. It is the best deck in Marvel Snap. As far as Star-Lord, this seems to be the way a lot of people at High Infinite are putting him together. It was pioneered by Honifer, with the idea being that a lot of people are looking to counter your turn 5 Star-Lord, so becoming a better deck, or your turn 4 Star-Lord into turn 5 multipliers. So becoming a better deck at being a small ball Star-Lord list means that you can still leverage the power of the card while going over the top. But I do think that people are very prepared for this kind of stuff. And while it has kept Honifer in the top 10, that is a very talented player who's designed this deck to do very specific things. The Wasp, for example, is to deal with things like a Jean Grey or a Negasonic. A lot of small things like that that are very much keying off of your understanding, not just of a matchup, like playing a Mobius to beat Mr. Negative, but of a play pattern in a matchup, how a matchup tends to play out. A lot of the people playing certain ways to beat you. You have to be very judicious with this kind of deck because there are going to be games where you have a magic in hand, and you're like, I should play that magic, and you're going to be wrong about that. That kind of stuff. Deploying your tools when and where they are needed, and that level of restraint makes this deck quite hard to play. But it is still incredibly strong, and if Star-Lord has a future, I think it looks a lot more like this than at any of the all-in combo decks. This is Star-Lord's best case for being what people are scared that it is. And I think it's making a reasonable case, but I'm not sure it's reasonable enough. This is still where I'm at for all-in Star-Lord. There's a couple of iffy things here where it's like, okay, I like the Daredevil, but I can see running Legion. I like the Juggernaut, but I can see running Legion. There's a little bit of flex in this list, but if you want to play the all-in Star-Lord deck, this is the list that you want to be doing it with. It is probably the best all-in Star-Lord deck at beating the other all-in Star-Lord decks, so if you're in a sort of local metagame that is dominated by this guy and you don't really feel like building a deck to counter him, you can just play the mirrors, although personally, in my opinion, the mirrors do not have a ton of skill expression in them. Another card that's a little bit interesting is Red Hulk here, who is a lot better in mirrors than he is anywhere else. At least at High Infinite, I have noticed the utility of this guy going dramatically down, as people have swapped over to anti-Star-Lord lists, or lists that curve out more, Shou-Lao stuff, Doom 2099 stuff. He's a lot smaller than he is now. more than he was a week ago. Let's talk a little bit about the decks that are built to farm Star-Lord. I think Supergiant is one of the best decks in the entire game at not just beating up Star-Lord, but at making the game feel sane again. I think a lot of people who play this game are really taken aback by how much things get out of control, and it's really interesting to see a deck like this that is perfectly capable of dealing with almost anything anyone is putting up against it, with a bunch of cards that individually just aren't that good and really are mostly about taking away your opponent's options. This deck is a little bit worse than when everyone was playing Star-Lord, because you will run into some really awful matchups, like Doom 2099, for example, is functionally an unwinnable matchup for you. They are just so much better, and their turn 4 allows them to do a bunch of ridiculous stuff, and you are, as a Negasonic deck, pretty terrible against a Doom on turn 5. But there are some good matchups in the world for this deck, and a lot of them are decks that are just like playing a relatively fair, mid-rangey kind of game plan. I like this deck into the Batroc decks in as much as I can like any deck into those decks. I like this deck into the Star-Lord decks a lot. There's just some kind of upside here. It also manages to cut off at the knees anything that is relying on a turn 5. So like if your Tribunal opponent is really caring deeply about, oh, it's time to make sure that we get rid of Sarah, you know, if they're doing like a I'm gonna wave an onslaught in play Sarah kind of deal, you're good into that. You're just good into a lot of small, weird stuff, and there's a lot of that running around. There are going to be some decks that are just outpowering you power to power, but anything that's relying on card text, especially on reveal card text, is the kind of thing you're very set up to deal with. If you want to play a Batroc list that is heavily set up to beat Star-Lord, Daredevil, and Cosmo does a lot of that work as well. I personally think that this list is falling off at High Infinite because it's really, really hard for you to beat the Shou-Lao version of this list with this version of the list, but you can do it depending on how well you're able to navigate it. This is sort of a fusion between the Supergiant deck and the Shou-Lao version of this list. It's really a testament to just how completely ridiculous the general core of Batroc, Sam Wilson, Kraven, and Hydra Stomper is. That's just so much free power that you can kind of do whatever you want in the space, and you'll be able to customize that shell to whatever is happening. I suggested Batroc get nerfed in an 8 Cubes episode I did a little bit ago, and like the more I think about it, the more he just seems like such a clear outlier compared to every other one. Your other good ones in the game are like, I'm a 1/3 with some upside, and Batroc's just like 15 power over the course of the game. It's a little much. Another very solid Daredevil Cosmo deck is Cerebro 3. This deck gets to be a Daredevil Cosmo deck, meaning it's relatively favored into a variety of Star-Lord decks, but it also allows itself to be a powerful stacking combo deck, meaning it is a deck that I think is really well positioned in a world where people are playing a bunch of sort of small ball-y Star-Lord counters and not a lot of interaction for this. One thing that you do have to keep an eye out for is that people are playing Echo in the Year of Our Lord 2026 for various reasons. Usually it's like in a Star-Lord deck to prevent the Cosmo from beating you, things of that nature. But it does exist, and you have to pay attention to it, and there's probably more Echo running around right now than there ever has been, which is admittedly a very low bar. This is a deck that I think middles the metagame pretty well, though. It has the anti-Star-Lord package, and then just like a really, really high amount of relatively uninteractable points in the form of just being a Cerebro deck. That means that it should be a deck that is favored against a lot of the mid-rangey decks that are thriving in the wake of Star-Lord being countered a lot. The best way to describe this metagame is a bunch of fairly medium mid-rangey decks benefiting from the decks that are going out of their way to counter Star-Lord, because the decks that are going out of their way to counter Star-Lord are devoting some slots to that, so these other mid-range decks, by not devoting slots to that, are able to go over the top of them, and this is a deck that is actually able to do both of those things, which I think puts it in a very interesting position. If you just want to play a list that has enough power to win games, but is also going to have a ton of interactive tech pieces in it, I think you can get a lot of value out of playing a list like this. This is an Aurora mid-range deck that is full of answers. There are tons and tons and tons and tons of things that happen when you play this list. There are a million different ways to do a million different things, all of them relying on you having the right answer for what your opponent is playing. For example, Jean Grey Cosmo into the Star-Lord stuff, or generally stacking power into the mid-range decks. This is a deck that is very reliant on its disruption actually mattering, which means that the current bug with Spider-Ham is really bad for it. Almost bad enough that I would consider swapping it out for a different card. For those unaware, Spider-Ham is currently not showing what card he hits and also not playing his animation. But your opponent is able to look at their hand and see what card was hit, whereas you are not able to actually see that at all. When they fix this, I think this deck will get markedly better. As is, it is hurting from that lack of information. This is a deck that is using disruption in the form of Cosmo, Stardust, and of course the aforementioned Spider-Ham to go along with a game plan that is built around the idea of just being a big Aurora deck. This deck does points pretty well, like that is the biggest upside to it. But there are some things that push against you in the form of just, this is a fairly minimal amount of points. It meets the bar for, are you able to beat a deck with numbers? But it doesn't exceed that bar by much. In fact, I would argue that it probably is the bar. This is the lowest possible amount of numbers you can be making and still compete in the metagame. I've enjoyed my time with the 2099 list. It feels like it's the ramp of this metagame, which is to say that in a world where everyone is playing Star-Lord counters, this is a deck that bypasses basically all of them and says, all right, well, nice Star-Lord counter deck. I just have more points than you. And that is a super valid strategy. This is a super valid thing to do, except you only run one copy of Doom 2099, and you only get to do that when you draw your one copy of Doom 2099. And so it's like, all right, well, enough of the time I'll be doing this. But right, and when you really start stacking things up, you're a Star-Lord deck. Your Star-Lord is just named Doom 2099, and you draw it about as much as they do, which means that when you actually play against Star-Lord, their draws are better than yours when both of you are doing the thing. So it's a mid-range deck that is positioning itself to beat up on the decks that are beating up on Star-Lord, but it does definitely lose the Star-Lord matchup as long as the Star-Lord player is even remotely invested in being a combo deck, because that's the cost you pay in order to be a Doom 2099 deck. You don't get the option to do all this cool stuff. But there is a lot of power in here. Like, you really shouldn't underestimate the strength of Moondragon and Chamber, just in terms of, like, being overstated twos that work really well with an Aurora game plan. That stuff is just great. Drax is a very solid card as well. Mercury allows you to deal with the Batroc decks. You have a lot of power in here, and I think you are favored against most things that aren't a Star-Lord combo just by being bigger than them, especially if you're actually able to play Doom 2099, but you are legitimately doing things even when you don't do that. I don't normally do this kind of editorializing in the middle of the video, but I think it's really important to actually talk about this. The metagame at High Infinite, I think, is pretty different from the metagame everywhere else. And I don't mean different in the sense of like fundamentally different. I just mean different in the sense of like ahead, right? So a lot of what happens at High Infinite will happen at other ranks, but you need to pick your place in the circle effectively. If you imagine a circle where at the top of the circle, it's Star-Lord, then there's an arrow going down the circle pointing to deck that beats Star-Lord, then there's an arrow going down to deck that beats that deck, and then there's another arrow going back up to Star-Lord. A lot of that is an easy way to understand this, right? Like you have, you know, your basic Star-Lord deck, which loses to a Super Giant deck, which loses to a Doom 2099 deck, which loses to a Star-Lord deck, right? And so a lot of it is like, all right, well, where on the cycle are you? Where is your metagame at? And in High Infinite, one of the things that's happened is it's just like kind of actively bad to play Star-Lord right now. Like that's really kind of what it feels like up there, is just like we are very much in that second spot where it's just like everyone is prepared for him. And there's just really like, even as someone who kind of expected there to be a pretty decent chance that this happened, it's happened in a way that I think is remarkable and potentially localized. And I want to be able to give that disclaimer before I talk about the next couple of decks, because these are decks that people are having success with in High Infinite, But I do think a lot of it is predicated on the fact that everyone else in High Infinite is so prepared for Star-Lord that it just doesn't even feel right to play him a lot of the time right now. And that's one of the hard things about making a video like this, because you'll notice I had Star-Lord pretty close to the beginning of the tier list. I still think the deck is good, but the metagame at High Infinite is extremely hostile to that, and I don't want to be hostage to my own perceptions. I want to make a video that actually helps you, and this is one of those times where it's very difficult to parse that out. And so I wanted to put this in the video so you understood where my head was at before we started talking about some decks that look like ridiculous piles, but in a world where the metagame at High Infinite is so, I guess I'd say, compact. Like, things are very low point ceiling and relatively fair because those are the decks that actually beat Star-Lord, right? And so you get a bunch of decks that are kind of bad, but they're good enough to beat the decks that beat Star-Lord, and so they're running around at High Infinite and doing interesting stuff. And that's largely how I conceptualize the next few decks that we're going to talk about. Fantomex is a pretty solid mid-range deck at beating other mid-range decks. And in a world where everyone is, you know, playing a mid-range deck with a Star-Lord counter, Fantomex can do some work. The downsides are you're not a great anti-Cosmo deck, but you're better than you'd think, right? Like, you can't, like, leave an obvious lane for them to Cosmo, but you are good at playing around that stuff like, oh, no, I played the hood or whatever, right? Like, you Killmonger your hood. You don't have to Carnage your hood. You have ways to get through Cosmo in the form of a zombie Captain Marvel as well. Like, you can do stuff. This deck does points fairly efficiently. Fantomex is a really big guy. Gambit is a really good card right now. And so you have also this ability to have like these final turn Gambit Killmongers. That stuff is really good against Shou-Lao, especially if you're able to throw priority, because Shou-Lao, if they're doing the Maverick stuff, they are going to put the power onto a 1-drop usually. Blowing that up is really good. This Gambit stuff is always just generally very good in worlds like this. And of course, Batroc is running around, which is a great Killmonger target. There's some really good hits in here for those cards, and that allows you to do things like final turn, Killmonger, and Gambit, and then you activate your Fantomex, and it's just like they spent their whole game building this stuff up, and it just kind of goes away. There's a lot of that in this deck where it's a much better deck at being a mid-range deck than I think you would think. A lot of what it tries to do is throw priority and have these interactive stuff, and that can be risky. And it definitely, in a million years, is never beating a Star-Lord, but because of the metagame context, there's enough non-Star-Lord that you can just kind of look at it and be like, all right, well, if I get Mr. Negative, I get Mr. Negative. I'm going to go. I've particularly enjoyed this bounce list from Big Baby. Very similar to something that a player named Doc Guapo loves playing, but I really like specifically the Grandmaster use case here. Like, the Lin Lee Grandmaster stuff is very slick. Bouncing stuff with Grandmaster is also very slick. There's just a lot of interesting things going on here. And of course, you are, of course, a Shou-Lao deck, which means that you are very much a beast on 4 deck a lot of the time, because you beast on 4, play 5 cards on 5. Once you have played 5 cards, you have Shou-Lao and a Sasquatch, and that's just a really powerful thing to do. There are worlds where, like, you could get to a point where you are going to, like, play a Shou-Lao and try to Grandmaster it. It's possible. It's very possible. But I think a lot of the time you're mostly just playing for that final turn show. The Lin Lee stuff in Bounce is just a big boost to the overall output of the deck. Being able to move your Lin Lee around with all of the ways you have to bounce it, and of course Grandmaster to reposition it, very, very strong. A lot of sequencing in here, and also the 1-drops built to disrupt. This deck doesn't have any actual hard tech, so you rely on things like Iceman and Korg to just try to take the top off of your opponent's ability to combo you out of the game a lot of the time. Iceman especially is a card I think is really underrated. That guy is quite good in this world. Cougar has been playing an Infinity Ultron Wong list that does need to run Echo in order to make sure that it doesn't get heinously Cosmoed, but there are some interesting things going on here. Basically, you have 2 5-drops that are kind of ridiculous to copy on Wong, and then your final turn is just a lot of power. If you can somehow get 4 stones out of that Infinity Ultron with a Quinjet, you are going to be able to play a billion different things, and it's going to be a whole lot of power. Again, though, I think lists like this are sort of predicated on the idea of, look, there are a lot of people beating Star-Lord for us, so whatever mid-range deck we want to play, we can go over the top with. And I think if you're going to play something that is this reliant on a Wong, or really any on reveal that is remotely telegraphed, you do have to actually play the Echo, and you have to really care about that. There are going to be some decks that put you in a blender. Like, that is just how this is going to work. But I do think that a lot of people's eyes will be drawn by the Wong, and they'll be like, what is this ridiculous pile? And they'll overlook that, like, the rest of this deck is actually just a really good Shou-Lao deck with a lot of ways to multiply a powerful effect. Another Infinity Ultron list comes from KM Worst. I like this twist on Wiccan, even though I don't like playing Wiccan. The twist here being that instead of using Wiccan's extra energy to play a lot of cards, what we're doing is we're using his extra energy to play smaller but still impactful ones. No Fin Fang Fooms here, no sixes, just some good cards that will win us games without needing to go ridiculous. Now, there is one really important note here, and this is I don't know if it's intentional, I don't think it is. Wiccan is now caring about the turn that you play him, which is not how he's worded. But if you have extra energy on turn 4 and you play Wiccan, like let's say you have a Superior Spider-Man down there and you have 5 energy on 4, he will not proc. So that's really bad. One of the things that this deck does that is nice, though, is Quicksilver into the Shang Rings into Superior Spider-Man, which gets you to 5, starts really accelerating your stuff, extra energy quite early. It's quite consistent. I honestly feel like I kind of like that a little bit more than I like Wiccan, especially now that they don't work well together. But I do think that there is something to be said for the old school style. Again, this is a deck that only exists because of everyone else countering Star-Lord. In a face-up game against the Star-Lord stuff, it will come out on the downside. But I mean, that's also true of playing against Mr. Negative, and that is kind of what Star-Lord has become, especially at High Infinite. One card that I think is particularly interesting in the current metagame context is Valkyrie, especially without priority. Smiz has been playing some interesting, I guess you'd call it Temu Negative, with Pixie and, of course, the top end of Gore and Mystique. But Valkyrie is a pretty interesting card in this world. It's just a better Shang-Chi, kind of, because, you know, the thing about Shang-Chi is it only hits one guy now, and frankly, when you're playing against a lot of the metagame, you need it to hit more than one guy. So this deck is able to lock certain lanes down with that. If you're able to accelerate your energy well, if you're able to cheat your energy well enough with Pixie or Anti-Venom, it can do some really powerful stuff. Gore Mystique, Iron Man Mystique, very much a sort of knockoff Negative deck, but I think it's a little bit better prepared for what this metagame actually is by what am I saying? I want to say interpolating, but I don't think that's the word I'm looking for. By including a card like Valkyrie, maybe interpolating was right. Anyway, by including a card like Valkyrie in the list in order to allow it to have a sort of reactive game plan as well as just a proactive one, I think that stuff is pretty useful to a deck like this. It's mostly, I think, kind of a Valk merchant and a surprise merchant, but you can really snap on some of these draws. Like, there are going to be some really powerful games and some really not powerful games once you Pixie people. But a good Pixie will let you compete on a level with basically anything in the game. And you know what time it is. It's time to talk about Destroy. This is still the list of Destroy that I would recommend. Destroy's in an interesting position where it's a little underrated. I think it does its points particularly well. It is a very powerful deck when it draws the right hands, and Marvel Snap is a little more conducive than it usually is to people just sort of respecting your snaps and generally understanding that your output is quite large. This is a deck that is able to do points powerfully. It is also a deck that is quite vulnerable to a priority Cosmo in a world where people are playing plenty of priority Cosmos. The most important card of this deck is Killmonger because it's the one Destroy card that can free your cards up from a potential dog lockdown. That's definitely the biggest risk of playing this list. Other than that, though, when you draw well, this list is rolling downhill against basically anything in the game. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Let me know what you think in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe. I will see you in the next one.